Started my first startup in 97. The world told me I was insane.
Our goal is creating future economies that are more regenerative and sustainable.
Something didn't match up. Why hasn't this become the next big thing? And that's where we invested.
The whole purpose of achieving anything in life is measurement.
Hello, everyone. We are excited to introduce the team at Squire, Patton, Boggs, who's going to be giving an overview of the U.S. infrastructure bill. This is a keynote that I'm very excited for. I know many of you in the audience are as well, with billions potentially earmarked for us to improve our civil infrastructure as well as our vertical infrastructure. So without further ado, I'm going to first give a brief overview of the session, and then I will introduce our panelists. So this session, the Biden administration and the United States Congress are on the cusp of making critical investments in infrastructure on a scale unseen in America for generations, if ever before. Join us now for a behind-the-scenes look at the high-stakes maneuvering in Congress thus far, as well as for perspective on what's next. A team at Squire, Patton, Boggs here joining us now will also provide insight on how your business might capitalize on this transformative change. So I will now introduce Amol, Naik, principal at Squire, Patton, Boggs; Caren Street, also principal at Squire, Patton, Boggs; David Saltzman, a partner at Squire, Patton, Boggs; Tommy Andrew, principal at Squire, Patton, Boggs; and Austin Harrison, policy and regulatory associate at Squire, Patton, Boggs. So Amol, I will pass it over to you and let you take it over. As a quick reminder to all the attendees, please feel free to share your questions in the right-hand side of the screen in the chat or the Q&A, and we'll be sure to get those answered in the session. Take care.
Thank you, Ian. It's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you to Shadow Ventures, to Ian, to my good friend KP Reddy for having us. We're thrilled to be here. Squire, Patton, Boggs is a global law firm and public policy firm. We have public policy folks all over the world, including myself in Atlanta, and Austin Harrison also in Atlanta, and my colleagues Caren Street and Tommy Andrews in Washington. And then we also have our colleague David Saltzman calling in from Palo Alto to kind of give a VC perspective. I know that's top of mind. I'll do more introductions as I get to my colleagues. We're really excited about this opportunity. Infrastructure really is the topic of the day. There's been sort of years and years of infrastructure week attempts, and nothing has really happened. And then frankly, what has been going on in recent days with the Biden administration and bipartisan support in Congress is really something that hasn't happened in the United States in terms of infrastructure investment, arguably since the Eisenhower administration. As you go around highways, you may see the 5 stars of Eisenhower. And that was when sort of infrastructure was funded. We're talking about 60 plus years ago. The Biden administration now is really taking the lead and trying to make that sort of infrastructure investment in our country, which I would argue is badly needed. So we'll get into the details on what we're talking about when we say infrastructure here. There's a lot of sort of legislative and procedural issues that my colleagues who have worked on Capitol Hill can sort of translate for you. But in short, there's really 2 major infrastructure packages. One is a $1.2 trillion package that is what you would consider kind of traditional infrastructure: roads, bridges, clean energy investments, and the like. That has passed the United States Senate in a bipartisan way, is now in the House. There's also a $3.5 trillion infrastructure package. And that's really infrastructure with a capital I, maybe all capital letters for the whole thing, and goes into areas that I would argue are much needed, but it's outside of probably what your focus is as businesses and social services and the like. And like I said, we'll really get into all these details. Our team is all over this. We have clients all over the world focused on these issues. We're thrilled to talk about them today. Just a bit about my background. As I said, I'm on the public policy team here at Squire, Patton, Boggs. Before joining the firm, I was at Google for about 7 years and ran their public policy efforts in the southeastern United States, in addition to working at Google Fiber which is a telco initiative of Alphabet. I then went over to MailChimp, which is an Atlanta-based unicorn now that was actually acquired by Intuit last week for $12 billion. So good week for those folks. And then I went over to the city of Atlanta, where I was chief resilience officer for Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms and a senior advisor to her on her public policy initiatives. One of the things I focused on in great detail was smart cities, which I know is something that a lot of you all are focused on, and is really an exciting time for those in the smart cities industry as well. So we'll get into some real detail here. Like I said, we've got some folks that are very much focused on this issue and have a ton of experience. I will say that, kind of another stage setting item is that, there's a big focus here on infrastructure on three sort of major issues that maybe have not been tied to infrastructure in the past, as I'd argue they should have been. One is this infrastructure package really focused on jobs, right? So a lot of jobs will be created. There'll be a lot of downstream effects, and there'll probably be funding available for companies such as yours. Two is, and I know a lot of folks on this call are focused on this issue specifically, is climate change mitigation. As we know, the built environment is a major contributor of carbon emissions, and the infrastructure package is both very much focused on the existential threat of climate change. And the third piece is equity. As Secretary Buttigieg has said, in particular, infrastructure investments in the past have unfortunately sort of exacerbated societal inequalities, usually putting undesirable infrastructure in lower income, generally with people of color neighborhoods. And so you see that legacy throughout the country, and the infrastructure packages are very focused on not doing that again. In fact, kind of going the other way. So a lot to discuss here, an outstanding panel of my colleagues. We'll start first with Caren Street. Caren joined the firm in May of 2021 after serving as chief of staff to Representative Karen Bass, who I'm sure a lot of you have seen on television, a Democrat from California. She was the chief strategist for Representative Bass's legislative priorities. She also served as executive director for the Congressional Black Caucus under the leadership of Representative Bass. And Caren importantly played a key role in the passage of the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, which is really landmark legislation. Previously, Caren served as a policy director for then CBC Chair Cedric Richmond, who is a current senior advisor to President Biden and very involved in these issues. So we have a real expert here on sort of the way this actually works. So I know there's folks from all over the world. There's folks that probably don't live, eat, and breathe, politics like all of us on this call do. So I asked Caren to sort of walk us through I don't know if you all remember the Schoolhouse Rock cartoon where a bill becomes a law, but just to make sure that folks understand the basics on sort of how something needs to pass the House, the Senate, be signed by the president. Caren, if you could take it away.
Sure. So good to be here, Amol. Thank you for the question. I think it's important that we make this as inclusive a conversation as possible. And we here at Squire, Patton, Boggs recognize that DC can be a bit of a bubble that we need to help folks cut through. And for those of us who have worked on Capitol Hill, it's kind of like a bubble within a bubble. So I will not be singing anything today. So lower your expectations in terms of Schoolhouse Rocks. But I do want to kind of give folks a high level understanding of Congress and how Congress works. Congress being comprised of the U.S. House of Representatives and the United States Senate. Now, in order for any bill to become a law, it has to pass through both the House and the Senate. And these are two very different bodies with different compositions and different procedures and how they move. I'm not going to get into non-voting members and committees of jurisdiction and things like that, but it's important for you to just understand the composition and the procedures. So in the House, there are 435 members, who are all reelected every 2 years. So they are very close to their districts, and the House is just generally a very political chamber. Then there's the Senate, where you have 100 senators, and they are reelected every 6 years. So based on the science of voter memory, they pretty much get to govern for or legislate for 4 years and then really focus on the politics those last 2 years before they're reelected. So those compositions make kind of the political nature of the chambers very different. And also the rules are different. In the House, the majority rules. It's a simple majority to pass legislation. And so if you want a really relatively easy job, being in the House minority is easy. You just vote against the, the majority, and that's where you stand. The Senate is very different. It is considered the deliberative body. And I won't get into the history, but essentially any one senator can filibuster, which means to just continuously debate an issue. You don't even actually have to stand down on the floor and debate and rail against a policy or in support of a policy the way that you used to. Very simply put, in order for legislation to pass out of the Senate, it needs 60 votes. So that is not a simple majority. And that means that you have to be bipartisan, except for reconciliation. That's a term you may not have heard this time last year, but it is a very important process in the Senate that essentially allows the majority to do away with that 60 vote threshold and instead pass policies that are tied to the annual budget that the Senate has passed in order to move forward with any legislation. So they only get to do it one time a year because you have one budget a year. But it is this magical instrument that allows the Senate to move similarly to the House and put forward legislation with just a simple majority. The thing to remember in both the House and the Senate as it stands now is that there are very slim margins in both. You can, if you lose 4 votes, if you're Speaker Pelosi and you lose 4 votes, your legislation will tank on the floor. And if you are in the Senate, you have to have all 50 senators vote in support of your policy in order for Vice President Harris to cast the tiebreaker vote in support of that bill. So despite all of these procedures, because of those slim majorities, it makes for very exciting negotiations, which is what we're all watching for the next several weeks.
Thank you, Caren. That's super helpful. I've attended a lot of these in the past when the folks in politics and policy start using acronyms and terms such as reconciliation. So we wanted to make sure not to do that, have a baseline civics lesson, which Caren did a great job on. But it's all to say that one of the infrastructure packages has now cleared the Senate with bipartisan support, and that was the $1.2 trillion. There's a larger, the other infrastructure package, this $3.5 trillion that it doesn't seem at this point have the 50 votes in the Senate. And so we're kind of making the distinction there. And in terms of getting into the weeds a bit further, I'll bring in my colleague, Austin Harrison. So at Squire, Patton, Boggs, we're very much a bipartisan firm, which, as Caren noted, is critically important all the time, but especially now when you're talking about it's a 50-50 Senate, there's a 4-vote majority in the House. Really, if you want to do anything of substance, you have to be bipartisan. We very much are. Caren and I are Democrats, Austin and Tommy are Republicans, and we all work seamlessly together. Austin is a member of our public policy strategic advocacy practice, where he draws upon domestic and international policy experience to advise clients on matters involving administrative law, land use, and various public policy matters, including very much the infrastructure package. Austin knows more about the details than anyone I know, and he previously worked on Capitol Hill for 2 U.S. senators from his home state of Mississippi. Austin, if you want to give some kind of interesting tidbits of things that may be of specific interest in the $1.2 trillion package to these folks in the built environment space, and really any other observations that you have.
Sure. Thanks, Amol. It's as we look at the $1.2 trillion package, I think many of you that are on right now have seen headlines in various articles, and you see 1.2 trillion. And then if you scroll past that opening paragraph, maybe you've come across $7.5 billion to build out electric vehicle charging infrastructure, or $65 billion for rural broadband. All total, it's $550 billion in new spending. That is a lot of money. But the question that we always hear is, okay, so what does it mean for me, for my company at the end of the day? And so rather than running off the list of, X amount of money for this program, I think it's important to kind of move past the top line spending and look a little beneath, specifically related to competitive grant programs. Some of you may have experience working with federal grant programs or programs that are set up for states to reinvest in infrastructure. If you look at this bipartisan package, there's a distinct focus on promoting resilient and sustainable infrastructure projects. I've seen commentary where a lot of folks are urging House members and senators to move beyond just fixing the pothole and think about more of a long-term solution. So competitive grant programs, there are a number, from encouraging large urban areas to plant more trees or put in more sidewalks, whatever it may be, to a RAISE program, for example, which would create a partnership with states to build out this infrastructure. There's infra grants, which are discretionary grants. There's a Reconnecting Communities pilot program. And we could go on and on down the list, but I think what's important here is to, one, identify potential grant opportunities or pilot programs where your business can insert itself. And when I say insert itself, it's working with state and locals, because for the most part, it's state, locals, and tribal nations that are eligible for these grants. Then they will go look to the private sector on how to implement them, how to use this funding. So it's identifying those programs. And then the states where you have experience, I would encourage you to start having the discussion with state DOT officials, the governor's office, the decision makers, and really just try to educate state decision makers on the programs that you all create. And I know they from the audience today, it differs broadly on exactly what your capabilities are. But I think that would be my initial suggestion here, Amol. I think we'll have a chance to get into maybe some more details on the legislation, but just wanted to focus a little bit on the issues that may not always come across on the front page.
Thank you, Austin. That's very helpful. I had an opportunity during the presidential campaign to work with the Biden campaign on infrastructure issues in Georgia as sort of an advisory committee. And, I want to underscore what Austin is saying there. A lot of the thinking is, don't just fix the pothole, go to the underlying issue, whether it be climate change, equity, or otherwise related. And so, we're kind of breezing by these numbers, trillions, billions. If you really kind of, again, stop and think about this, this is just generational investment. It really is in broadband, rural broadband, for instance. As COVID has demonstrated, if you don't have a fast internet connection, you're really not part of society. And that has broad bipartisan support. the clean energy investments, the EV investments. So if I'm sitting there in the audience today, I am thrilled, not only as a business person, but as an American, that this is, proceeding. And so I think there's a lot of opportunity that we're happy to get into. We'll get into specifically how you might, as a business entity, actually try to shape this process and try to benefit from the opportunities. So on that note, we'll go to our colleague, Tommy Andrews, who has some real outstanding sort of practical experience on how this works. I don't know if anyone is a West Wing sort of addict as I am, but Tommy is probably like the Josh Lyman or something from the last administration. He can draw his own analogies to what character he'd be on Veep. But Tommy served as a special assistant to the president for legislative affairs. In that role, he advised the president and senior administrative officials on legislative strategies, for focusing primarily on the House of Representatives. The strong relationships he has on Capitol Hill were instrumental in passing the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement, long-term extension of the Export-Import Bank, and most recently, the critical bipartisan COVID-19 relief measure, the CARES Act, phases 2 through 4. I'm sure there's plenty of folks that are very familiar with CARES on this call. Previously, Tommy worked on Capitol Hill for 2 speakers of the House, one being Speaker Paul Ryan, the other being Speaker John Boehner, who is a colleague of ours at Squire, Patton, Boggs. So, Tommy, based on your extensive experience, what does this look like? What are the folks in the Biden administration doing to try to, get the Senate package through the House, to rally support for the $3.5 trillion measure? Can you give us some of the sort of sausage making, and feel free to provide any anecdotes from the work you've done in the past?
Of course. Amol, thank you. Everyone, nice to meet you. Thanks for being here. We have a saying for what's going on in D.C. right now for the month of September. If any Green Day fans are on this call, the theme has been "Wake Me Up When September Ends." This is the craziest month in years, with so many deadlines approaching. As Amol talked about, the infrastructure package that's currently in front of us, that's kind of taken a back seat in the last couple weeks to the meat and potatoes of governing that have to happen by October 1st, with government funding expiring by the end of the fiscal year. You've also got the debt ceiling and the debt limit, which is going to hit in sometime mid-October. So Congress has 4 or 5 jump balls in the air right now. The Biden administration is bringing members of Congress down to the White House today in different tranches with the different factions of Congress. Think of it as like the school lunchroom cafeteria. You've got different pockets of folks sitting at different tables, whether that's progressives on the left, far-right conservatives on the right. You've got moderates on both sides, and there's these different pockets. And with, as Caren mentioned, slim majorities in both the House and the Senate. Threading that needle is a fine art right now. And so as Amol mentioned, you might have been a fan of House of Cards or of The West Wing or Veep, and you understand how those shows depict DC. If anybody's seen Veep, in my opinion, that's actually the most accurate show about how Washington works. The sausage-making process of how a bill becomes a law is very arcane. It's a lot about personalities. There's a lot of posturing that is happening right now. You'll see members of Congress on the news or on Twitter. They're saying certain things, putting their line in the sand on where they stand. But in reality, what's happening right now is the big 4, which is Speaker Pelosi, Mitch McConnell in the Senate, Chuck Schumer in the Senate, and Kevin McCarthy. Those are the 4 leaders of Congress. Them and their staffs are working behind the scenes right now on several matters. Will the government get funded? Probably. Will we default? No. But right now, they're going to go up till the last possible point, because Congress runs on deadlines. That's just the way it is to get anybody moving on anything. What's happening right now is this chess game. And so you've got, Biden trying to peel off votes here. And if we want to talk about whipping, so we're trying to whip this infrastructure bill. Well, as we're on this call, I just got an email from the whip's office. The House GOP Republicans in the minority, they are formally whipping against this bipartisan infrastructure bill. And there are concerns when it passed the Senate in a bipartisan fashion, it got 19 Republicans in the Senate. So we're on the 50-yard line. We're halfway there. But there's different dynamics in the House, because House Republicans are viewing this bipartisan infrastructure bill as linked to the bigger package that Caren and Amol talked about, this $3.5 trillion package. They see it as linked together. Normally they'd be for this $1 trillion infrastructure bipartisan, no problem. But because they're linked together, theoretically, they feel it's a Trojan horse. That might change, but for right now, we were expecting at least 3 or 4 dozen House Republicans to vote for this package. The fact that they just sent out a formal whip notice changes things drastically. I've heard as many as maybe they could get 4 Republicans now, which is unfortunate. Me being a Republican, I'd love to see this package passed because it does a lot of good for roads, bridges, infrastructure, hard infrastructure for our country that is much needed. Lastly, I'll just talk Amol about whipping votes. If they're whipping against, whipping is an art form. There's no one better at whipping votes than Speaker Pelosi. Never underestimate Nancy Pelosi. She knows everything about every one of her members in her caucus, their wants, their needs, their concerns. A few quick anecdotes, lessons in terms of whipping. Speaker Boehner, when he was Speaker of the House, he referred to whipping as herding cats or trying to keep 218 frogs in a wheelbarrow long enough to pass something before they jump out. It's hard to pass stuff through Congress. And so when you're whipping, you've got a few tools at hand. In the olden days, earmarks were the big thing that the speaker or the whip could offer out to members of Congress. Hey, you need that new park in your district, or you need that new bridge in South Carolina. Well, if you vote yes, we can get that line item funding for you. That kind of went away when Boehner banned earmarks. They are coming back in a different fashion. But there are other tools that members of Congress have at their disposal to help whip votes. For instance, the White House, whether it's getting members of Congress on Air Force One or taking them to Camp David, or even if we had a member that was going against the way we wanted them to vote, dangling the threat of, hey, the president has a tweet lined up. It's not good. He's going to hit this send button if you don't vote for this. More times than not, members would say, I'm voting for the bill. Boehner had a style of bringing members into his office as a habitual smoker, 2.5 packs a day. He liked to lock the door, point to the door and saying, that's not opening until you guys say yes. And I've got 2 months worth of cigarettes in that top drawer. So it only took about 30 minutes for those folks to change their mind and vote yes. There are several ways to do it. I would just say, don't underestimate Nancy Pelosi. They'll find a way to do this, but you're just going to see the posturing right now. With that, you'll back.
Thank you, Tommy. That's really helpful. And, this shows, we're talking about an email in real time of the House Republican whip saying that they're officially against this bipartisan measure, right? So that's something we didn't know 30 minutes ago or whatever. So it really is a very live conversation. And so there's a lot going on here. So we would stress that, no one knows exactly what the final package is going to look like, not even the speaker or the president, but we do have a good sense of what has happened thus far. And based on that, we wanted to bring in our colleague, David Saltzman, who is a partner at the firm. So we have a big public policy team, and we have a much bigger, frankly, legal team. It's a law firm at the end of the day. I think we have 44 offices in 19 countries or something like that. It's hard to keep up. There's a lot of growth. But David is based out in Palo Alto, and he advises clients in all areas of corporate and securities laws, focusing on mergers and acquisitions, joint ventures, sales and purchase of equity and debt structure, securities, and corporate governance matters of importance to probably a lot of folks on the call. He devotes a substantial amount of his practice to representing emerging growth companies and investment funds in private equity and venture capital matters, and has extensive experience with venture capital financing and fund formation. So we wanted to bring David in based on his extensive experience as a lawyer working with VCs and startups and the like, to sort of give his perspective on where some opportunities may be. David?
Thanks, Amol. Good to be here. It's actually a term that Austin used earlier that resonated with me here when he said you have to look underneath, because I don't think you're really going to see many funds that are going to put themselves out there and hold themselves out as infrastructure funds. It's specific technologies or areas that are going to be the focus. Investment funds, venture capital funds, PE funds, they look at stages of companies, sectors, geographies, whereas infrastructure is just a very broad term that means a lot of different things. And I don't think you're really going to see many investment funds saying we're going to invest in bridge builders or, road pavers. There's going to be money flowing to those companies, but there are low barriers to entry, and frankly, they're not very sexy. It's new technologies, if you will, that are really going to attract attention, in my opinion. This reminds me a little bit of when the qualified opportunity zones opportunities came out. Didn't really hear much about funds saying that this is what we're going to focus on. Out of all the funds out there, most of them still stuck with their main focus or a particular focus, and the qualified opportunity zone aspect was a consideration of where to invest, but it wasn't the main consideration. And I think we've got the same thing going on here. We talked about climate change. Well, I think everyone on this call is old enough to remember about 7 years ago or so, green energy was the big thing for venture capital investing. But after a few years, it kind of disappeared almost as like a fad, if you will. And then after the 2016 election, it definitely dropped by the wayside. Even before, well, not completely by the wayside, but the interest had dropped. And it had already started dropping even before that, when the general talk was that the cost of producing green energy, energy efficient goods, was getting very expensive, or certainly more expensive than desired at the time when gas and oil were much less expensive. Now we're in a different era again. Climate change is the operative term. And I think that green energy funds are going to find the infrastructure bill very attractive. Whether it's looking at carbon capture, reclamation of petroleum, or other rubber products, it's looking underneath the top layer of the infrastructure bill. Who really is getting the money? How are they going to apply it? What are the barriers to entry that they have? What kind of new technologies are they developing? Now, again, of course, the question is also going to be who exactly is going to be doing the investing. There are a lot of first-time investors, or I should say first-time funds, and a lot of micro funds being those with under 50 million or 100 million. The number of micro funds, I've read the stats, are growing, although the amount of aggregate capital they have compared to all the funds is actually dropping. Everyone out there has, I'm sure, heard a million times about how there is so much dry powder out there. So there are already a lot of funds already out there that are making investments, looking to make more investments with the money they have. And if they've already been in existence, they've already, I don't want to say marketed themselves simply because of the marketing rules, but they've had PPMs and whatnot. And if the minutia of infrastructure was not already part of their focus, it's not suddenly going to become part of their new focus. New funds may focus on it, but again, it's going to depend on the very specific areas. It's not just going to be the building. It's going to be what kind of technologies can be applied in the buildings or the building aspects.
Thank you, David. That makes a lot of sense. And one of the things we want to focus on now, we can turn to this, is, how would someone get engaged? How would a company that wants to participate actually get engaged? And I find myself working with a lot of late stage technology and infrastructure companies, often venture backed, that are in a disruptive space, disruptive business model. They're doing things that are new, and they're being regulated in ways that were never anticipated when the regulations were written, right? And so what we end up doing is we try to, whether it be insurance or technology or whatever it may be, adapt the current regulations to, this new business model, again, that didn't exist when the laws were written often 50 or 100 years ago. This is particularly important in the realm of privacy, not the topic of this conversation, but probably anyone that is involved in technology knows that the privacy scrutiny that's coming at the state level, in particular in places like Florida, is critical. And that's something that we certainly help a lot of clients on. But we want to make sure that folks that are in the audience who wanted to participate in this process know how and what that might look like, and what reasonably can happen. And so, Austin, kick it over to you here on sort of if you're sitting in the audience today, you hear some really interesting opportunities. What can you really do to kind of get involved in the process? What does that look like?
Well, I think that the important point first is that you have not missed out on opportunities in the infrastructure bill. Sure, months ago there were opportunities to refine language and work with supportive members to kind of narrow the focus, so to speak. But I think with this infrastructure bill, a lot of the opportunities are going to come post-passage. Many of the grant programs that I mentioned will be administered by USDOT, Department of Energy, EPA, and there's a requirement, 30 days, 60 days, for the respective agency to implement guidance on how states or how the federal government will run these programs. So I say that at the top to just emphasize that opportunities still exist. And to kind of, I guess, take a step back on more of a macro level, Amol, you mentioned just kind of the need to adapt and be nimble. And I know that's the case with the audience too, is that you approach a project in Oregon very different than you would approach a project in Mississippi, right? Because you understand the environment and kind of what you need to do to get down in that place. And that's how we try to approach a federal relations strategy as well. Starting, at the top level, understanding what your company may do, what your policy priorities are, what your focus is, and then moving through to identify those members in the House and the Senate who maybe you have locations in their state, or maybe they're just very active on a certain issue. Engage those members, and then throughout the policy process, whether it's the infrastructure bill, an appropriations bill, which is federal funding, or something on down the pike that is 3 months from now, we haven't even started to think about that. But if you want to influence policy, it's honestly a year-round process. And then I guess I'll just end with this, Amol. I know that kind of in this format, there's not always an opportunity to have follow-on discussions or ask specific questions. We've run through a lot of high-level information, but I know all of us that are on the call with Squire, Patton, Boggs would welcome the chance to have follow-on conversations, answer any questions, but I'll yield back.
That's right, Austin. Absolutely. We are definitely happy to have follow-up conversations. Ian has our contact information, and as a venture partner with Shadow Ventures, I actually have occasion pretty frequently to talk to member companies about some of these issues, and always enjoy the conversations. The sort of just kind of generalizing the conversations I've had on the infrastructure package, there's the kind of really very, very early startup that may not be seeking to influence the federal procurement process directly, but this is still very valuable for those folks to know because of the downstream effects, right? So they may not be the recipient of the government grant, but they may be the recipient of a contract from someone who receives a government grant. And then that you kind of go from that all the way to the larger companies that I know are involved who may want to influence the process directly. There's all sorts of grant opportunities. It's just one of those things where if you are in this space, being knowledgeable and conversant on the infrastructure package is critical. And we're certainly, to Austin's point, happy to have that conversation. We have a bunch of other stuff that we could go over, but Ian, we wanted to make sure to give folks an opportunity to ask some questions, understanding, again, that we're happy to follow up on anything specific. So, Ian, I don't know if there's any, I can't tell if there's questions or how you want to do that.
Yeah, we've got several questions, actually.
Right.
So I know we've got about 15 minutes to go. If our speakers are able to go over time, we will, but if not, we'll try to answer these as quickly as possible. So I'll just go ahead and fire away, and just know we've got about 7 or 8 questions. So we'll see if we can, maybe each one of you can take on one. So the first one comes from David Wiltz. what does the opportunity look like for fiber, broadband, and cellular, and how does the public sector track and manage the deployment with equity in mind?
That's a great question. I'm happy to start it off. And in fact, a lot of us are actually working on that very issue for some clients that are looking to be engaged specifically on broadband. And so, the investment opportunity here, the numbers that are in the infrastructure package, Austin probably has them top of mind, are enormous in terms of what passed the Senate. This is probably, and someone correct me if I'm wrong, this is probably the issue that has the broadest bipartisan support. The rural Republican senators who may not have been on board or aren't on board with other issues certainly understand that their communities need broadband. And from a private sector perspective, the more rural you get, the less profitable business is, frankly, right? Like, so as a general notion, I'm sure whoever asked the question is well aware of this, the infrastructure is an extremely large capital outlay to build a broadband network. And in a dense area where you're going to pick up a lot of customers going down a street, the investment becomes profitable much sooner than in a rural area when you're laying lots of conduit for one or two customers, right? It's just that the math is difficult. And somewhat akin to rural electrification, the infrastructure bill sort of takes that on as a government priority and maybe helps make the math work better for the private sector. So, Austin, I know you've been working on this as well. Anything come to mind in response to that question?
Yeah. So I mentioned before, I think if you kind of captured the various funding here, it's over $65 billion for broadband connectivity. The legislation, in terms of how those funds will be allocated, the legislation is not all that specific. There's one program where $42 billion set aside, states apply for the funding and receive a minimum of $100 million. So $100 million being the threshold, but 42 billion split up between the states and territories, you're likely to see more than that. As I understand that, how the broadband funds will be distributed from the states to private partners is going to differ on a state-by-state basis because, Amol, as you mentioned, kind of the rural element here where some states will focus more on the rural aspect. And then I'll finish by saying I think this is just the start of broadband funding. It is the hot topic in DC now. Connectivity, we saw during COVID so many children without access to internet. So, I mean, that's even ramped up the focus here. So you've got this infrastructure bill. There's going to be something else before midterm elections in November 2022. If it's another funding bill such as this, there's going to be more broadband opportunities there as well.
And if I could, I just want to flag that in that 65 billion specifically for broadband, there's 600 million for private activity bonds, which is really meant and kind of seen throughout a lot of the infrastructure package, these opportunities to kind of entice public-private partnerships and have give resources to public entities to try to entice in
Great. No, thanks for that.
private investment.
So I'll go ahead and throw in the next question here. It's switching gears just a bit. Will fuel taxes be replaced by VMT taxes as the electric vehicles become the majority of the vehicles on roads, bridges, and highways?
There's some folks directly working on that issue. Austin and Tom, if you want to jump in there, feel free.
Good question. So one of our other colleagues is Bill Schuster, who was the former chairman of the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. We've had a chance to talk with Schuster a number of times on this. I guess my initial reaction here is that the gas tax will continue as is. I think we're maybe a step removed from a vehicle miles traveled, but but it's coming. There's a lot of pressure from a number of organizations. We'll call it the pro-fuel or anti-EV groups that are emphasizing, the fact that a battery weighs a lot. It's going to put more pressure on roads. And at the end of the day, if you've got GM and Ford making all of these promises to go all electric by 2035 or whatever it is, we've got to have that continued reinvestment into our hard infrastructure. And so I don't know, Tommy, if you want to add on top of that.
The last thing I'd say is on vehicle miles traveled on VMT, there's support for VMT on both sides. So it is a bipartisan issue. So it's coming. They're trying to figure out how they do it. It's not going to happen this year probably, but the gas tax is not going to also increase. That's such a hot button issue, but the gas tax will remain intact. But they are losing revenues off that, so they got to find ways to factor in all those Teslas and other EV cars that are hitting the roads.
And Amol, maybe, and this is probably relevant for a lot in this group with vehicle miles traveled, I think there is a lot of privacy concerns here as well. Are you going to attach some monitor to the bumper of my car? My response is you walk around with an iPhone in your pocket all day. So no, we'll just track it there. But I think that will be a big debate item as this continues.
VMT really shows the complexity of every single issue involved here, right? You would, maybe initially say, how hard could that be? And then you start to peel it back. And there are so many interested groups. There's a lot of unusual coalitions behind that issue. There's, a lot of bipartisan support both ways. It just shows the complexity of it. And that's why it does pay to have a sophisticated entity like ours or others that are engaged in this process. Ian?
Awesome. So switching gears again, this question is for David specifically. On climate, how is it possible to solve climate change from an economic system that requires inflation?
I'm glad that's to David.
That's a very good question. And by good, I mean difficult. All I can think of is it just has to go back to new types of technologies. I've been speaking with a number of entrepreneurs that in recent years have not been able to get funding despite the technology. Now, I'm not a scientist, but the technology looks very good. And it looks like over time, it will be not only good for the environment, but more cost efficient. But the startup costs, of course, have been a lot, and that has been deterring people in recent years. So I'm not sure that really answers the question, but it's all got to come down to doing it efficiently, and the new technology is the way to do it.
And I'll just add to that, that's a really good and difficult question, of course, and I don't know that anyone would have a concise answer to it, but the thing that's of relevance to us is that the Biden administration and the Democratic Party specifically have made this issue of climate change one of the key central tenets of infrastructure, along with the equity issue. And so, we can get to the kind of theoretical and philosophical questions, but the sort of political reality is a kind of full-throated attempt to address climate change through the infrastructure package is very much top of mind for the president and the leaders of Congress on the Democratic side.
Great. And I know this next question, there's a lot of uncertainty kind of surrounding this, but we'll see what perspective you guys can share. So could you speak just a little bit more on the $100 million, and I think that number is accurate, $100 million in funds included in the bill for construction technology, and any idea or information on how those funds will be deployed?
I think I might have a good idea of who asked that question, and I enjoyed talking to them in the past. Also, I don't know if you have specific information on that, but it just shows you're talking about $100 million for somewhat of a niche area. And a lot of the reason that $100 million is there is the climate change factor that was discussed earlier. But Austin, I don't know if you have any specifics on that issue.
Maybe the only other thing to add is that there's an emphasis on kind of 3D modeling software. I think that 100 million number is a bit understated, just because that is a specific call out. But as you look at, if you kind of read through the language, there's consistent reference to maybe not construction tech explicitly, but just the need for long-term modeling, long-term, frequent assessments that we currently don't have the capabilities to do.
And the devil's in the details, right? And no one hates things more than lawyers saying it depends, but it does. It's going to depend largely on how this stuff plays out, what passes the House, what the House and Senate come to together, what's signed by the president, and then like the broadband question demonstrates, the money oftentimes will be allocated to the states, and then the states may have 50 different processes. And so with broadband clients, for instance, that we're working with, we have a multi-jurisdictional approach where you're looking at the federal bill and the legislation, but candidly, a lot of our efforts may end up coming down at the state level and influencing procurement there. And so, I think with the clean tech, we're going to have to kind of see how it plays out. But the fact that this number is out there and it's so specifically called out is a reason for the whole industry to rejoice, in my view.
I would also add, I think that underscores the fact that we are not we're not at the end of this process. We're still very much in the middle of it. And for so many new pilot programs that are coming through this bipartisan infrastructure package, there's still quite a bit of work to be done at the administration level, which is where our team is very engaged and excited, not just in terms of the passage in Congress, but engaging with the Biden administration for the next several months as these things come online.
That's a great point, Caren.
So we've got time for one additional question here. Will the debt ceiling fight upcoming in the Senate impact the $1.2 trillion bill coming to the states in a timely manner?
Let's throw that one to Tommy. That seems like a fun one for him to take on.
Well, could you repeat the last part of it, Ian?
Yeah, so I'll just repeat the question. Will the debt ceiling fight upcoming in the Senate impact the $1.2 trillion bill coming to the states in a timely manner?
Yes. I mean, if today's a very pivotal day, if the infighting with the Democrats who control Washington, they control the majorities in the House, Senate, and the White House, if they can get their acts together in a timely manner, this stuff's going to get delayed. Speaker Pelosi made a promise to her moderates that she would put this bipartisan $1.2 trillion infrastructure bill up for a vote next week. Well, the votes aren't there for that on her side right now because she's got 45 or so of her progressives saying, I'm not voting for that bipartisan bill until the bigger reconciliation's finished. So this could push things into the late fall, even winter. Time will tell. We'll see how today goes with the meetings at the White House that the Biden administration are holding with various members. So stay tuned.
I would just go back to what Tommy said earlier, which is to always bet on Nancy Pelosi. So, I mean, the stakes are high. We've alluded to this before that, Congress runs on kind of deadlines and crisis. And it's very easy on the outside looking in to think that this is a hot mess. But I think all of this pressure builds up. And although I could not tell you and game this out exactly how it's going to play out in terms of the CR and the debt ceiling and funding the government in December and the reconciliation package and finally moving the bipartisan infrastructure package out of the House. But I will say that to Tommy's point of Democrats controlling the House, Senate, and the White House, there is immense pressure within our party to actually deliver a win. The closer we get to the longer we let this slip, the more challenging it becomes. And it's in at least the Democratic Party's best interest to get this over the finish line, all of these issues over the finish line.
So there's to Karen's great point earlier, there's going to be a lot of back and forth. The media is going to love the kind of political drama. It'll be very interesting. But from a business perspective, will that have an impact on you? Yet to be seen. I think the thing to focus on from the business perspective is, what passes substantively. What are the pilot programs, to Caren's great point earlier, look like within the Biden administration? How can you potentially participate in one of those? If you're in broadband, how do you perhaps target state funding after they receive federal funds? So a lot of this stuff that's going to be in the media is really interesting, but perhaps not as relevant to your bottom line. The stuff that we're focused on here is what is relevant to your bottom line, which is very much how to take advantage of the opportunities, seek procurements, and the like.
And if I could, Ian, just 30 seconds. I know we're running up on the hour, but I guess to close that out just a little bit, wanted to provide a quick example. We're working with a company right now. I think they have maybe 5 full-time people. They're in the clean hydrogen space. They've seen the language in the programs to promote clean hydrogen. However, it's not clear in the legislation whether their technology is included in the way that it's described. So now we are working with EPA and the Department of Energy to ensure that the forthcoming guidance will capture their technology as well. So I just kind of wanted to, I guess, tie this to the real world of kind of what we're doing in practice right now.
That's a great example, Austin.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Well, we really greatly appreciate all of our panelists here on this session. Highly informative. I'm getting messages in like crazy, just saying how much people thoroughly enjoyed this information. Very educational. Thank you all very much. We still have an afternoon full of great sessions beginning right now. I'd just like to remind the entire audience that we do have our Shadow community of industry professionals, which is highly curated, just like Shadow Summit is. So investors, developers, general contractors, entrepreneurs. There's a lot of great folks within this community. So if you take a look at the chat within the main event, you can access the Shadow Circle community. Feel free to engage there. And it's a great opportunity to network with the other attendees and speakers. In addition to that, if anybody would like an introduction to connect with any of our panelists here on this keynote, reach out to me directly, and I'd be happy to work with these panelists in making introductions as well. But thank you again to David, Amol, Caren, Austin, and Tommy. It has been great.
Thank you, Ian.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you for having us.
All
Take
right,
care.
bye-bye.